In the early morning hours of February 24th, 1979, a seismograph beneath northern Utah recorded something that, by every rule seismologists understood at the time, simply should not have been possible. A magnitude 3.8 earthquake originating roughly 90 kilometers beneath the surface, deep enough to sit well below the planet's crust and into the upper mantle itself. Nobody felt it. Nobody believed the depth reading either, not for nearly half a century. The scientist who first calculated that number was quietly doubted for most of his career. This year, he came out of retirement to help prove himself right. The earthquake struck beneath Randolph, a small town in northern Utah near the borders with Idaho and Wyoming. At magnitude 3.8, it was a fairly minor event by any conventional measure, too weak and too deep for a single resident to notice anything happening beneath their feet. What caught the attention of George Zandt, then a postdoctoral researcher in seismology at the University of Utah, wasn't the size of the earthquake at all. It was the shape of the seismic data itself, recordings that simply didn't match what a typical shallow earthquake produces. When Zandt worked through the calculations, he landed at a depth of approximately 90 kilometers below sea level. That placed the earthquake's origin point far beneath Earth's crust, deep inside the upper mantle, a layer of the planet where the prevailing scientific understanding held that earthquakes simply couldn't happen at all. Here's why that depth broke a rule seismologists had relied on for decades. Continental earthquakes, the kind that happen beneath solid land masses rather than at ocean floor subduction zones, were understood to be confined to the crust, roughly the top 40 kilometers of the Earth's surface, where rock stays cold and rigid enough to store up mechanical stress and eventually fracture under pressure, the same basic mechanism behind essentially every earthquake most people have ever heard of. Below that boundary lies the mantle, where temperatures climb past 700 degrees Celsius and rock behaves in a fundamentally different way, bending and flowing slowly under pressure rather than snapping, suddenly the way brittle crustal rock does. An earthquake requires exactly that kind of sudden, brittle failure. Rock that flows like a slow-moving solid, the way mantle rock does, simply isn't supposed to be capable of producing one. A quake at 90 kilometers, in the interior of a continent nowhere near an active subduction zone, had no obvious mechanism to explain it at all. Zandt wrote up his findings in an abstract published in a journal called Earthquake Notes, and then largely the discovery went nowhere. Without a clear physical explanation for how an earthquake could possibly occur at that depth, in that specific geological setting, the findings sat unexplored and effectively unnoticed for decades, treated by much of the field as more likely an error somewhere in the original analysis than a genuine discovery about how the planet actually works. Everything changed when a new generation of University of Utah seismologists decided to take a fresh look. Led by geology professor Keith Koper, the team went back through the original 1979 waveform data alongside 8 additional suspected deep earthquakes that had occurred in the decades since across northern Utah and southwestern Wyoming, applying modern seismological analysis techniques that simply didn't exist when Zandt first worked the problem in 1979. Their findings, published in the journal Geophysical Research Letters, confirmed depths well below the crust for all 9 events. Zandt's original number held up completely under modern reanalysis. The team's research provided strong, direct evidence for the existence of an entire category of seismic activity scientists, now called continental mantle earthquakes, abbreviated CMEs, a genuinely rare class of earthquake occurring not within the crust, where virtually every other continental earthquake happens, but well into the upper mantle beneath it. The case for this new category grew stronger still just months later. On September 10, 2025, another deep earthquake struck near the town of Mazer in Utah's Uinta Basin, registering magnitude 4.1 at a depth of 68 kilometers. That placed it more than 20 kilometers below the Mohorovičić discontinuity, commonly shortened to the Moho, the well-established boundary marking where Earth's crust ends and the mantle begins. A second confirmed event, striking decades after the first, in the same general region, at a comparably extreme depth, meant this could no longer be dismissed as some kind of one-off anomaly or measurement fluke. It was a real, recurring pattern. It's worth understanding a bit more about the specific analytical techniques that allowed Koper's team to confirm these depths with confidence decades after the fact, since accurately locating an earthquake's depth is considerably harder than simply pinpointing its location on a map. Modern seismologists rely heavily on comparing the arrival times and characteristics of different types of seismic waves generated by the same earthquake, primary waves and secondary waves that travel through the Earth at different speeds and are affected differently by the specific rock layers they pass through. A shallow earthquake and a deep earthquake occurring at the same horizontal location produce measurably different wave patterns and arrival timing at surface seismometers, and modern computational modeling of exactly how seismic waves propagate through the layered structure of Earth's crust and upper mantle gave Koper's team a level of analytical precision simply unavailable to Zandt in 1979, working with far more limited computing power and a less developed theoretical understanding of deep continental seismicity. Applying that modern analytical framework retroactively to Zandt's original 1979 waveform recordings is precisely what allowed the team to confirm his original depth calculation with a level of confidence that wasn't achievable at the time he first made it. This discovery also invites a useful comparison to other categories of deep earthquakes scientists have documented in different tectonic settings entirely. Deep focus earthquakes are a well-established, well-understood phenomenon at active subduction zones, where one tectonic plate is being forced beneath another, sometimes producing genuine earthquakes several hundred kilometers below the surface, considerably deeper than even the Utah events. But those subduction zone earthquakes have a relatively well-understood physical explanation, involving mineral phase transitions within the descending, subducted slab of oceanic crust, changes in crystal structure occurring under specific pressure and temperature conditions that can trigger a sudden, brittle-style failure even in rock that would otherwise be expected to deform slowly. Utah's continental mantle earthquakes are considerably shallower than those subduction zone deep focus events, and critically, they're occurring in a completely different tectonic setting entirely, in the stable interior of a continental plate, nowhere near any subducting slab of oceanic crust. That's precisely why they required an entirely separate physical explanation, tied specifically to the unique structure of an ancient Craton root rather than to any subducting plate. If a discovery like this, an entire category of earthquake nobody believed could physically exist, changes how you think about what's actually happening beneath your feet, that's exactly the kind of science this channel exists to break down. So stick around, because the explanation for why this specific corner of the American West produces these events gets stranger the deeper researchers dig. All 9 confirmed continental mantle earthquakes cluster along a remarkably specific geological feature, the western edge of something called the Wyoming Craton, an exceptionally ancient, exceptionally stable section of Earth's lithosphere underlying parts of Wyoming and neighboring states. Cratons represent some of the oldest, thickest, most geologically stable continental crust anywhere on the planet, portions of Earth's surface that have remained largely undisturbed by the plate tectonic processes, reshaping most of the rest of the continent for literally billions of years. Keith Koper has described cratons using a comparison worth sitting with, comparing them to icebergs. What's visible at the surface represents only a fraction of the total structure, with a much larger root extending deep down into the mantle below, anchoring the stable crust above it. That deep root is exactly where these mantle earthquakes are occurring, along the edge where the ancient, rigid Craton root meets the surrounding mantle material. The region also runs unusually hot, with temperatures in the area regularly exceeding 700 degrees Celsius, hot enough that rock at these depths would typically be expected to deform slowly and continuously, rather than fail suddenly enough to generate a genuine seismic event. Researchers studying these continental mantle earthquakes believe the explanation lies specifically at the boundary between the ancient, rigid Craton root and the surrounding, more mobile mantle material flowing around it. As mantle material moves and flows against the edge of that comparatively rigid, deeply rooted Craton, it can generate concentrated, localized strain exactly along that boundary. Strain that, under the right specific conditions, can apparently exceed what the rock at that interface is able to accommodate through slow deformation alone, triggering a sudden, brittle failure even at depths and temperatures where that kind of failure was assumed to be essentially impossible. These events share some clearly distinctive characteristics that separate them clearly from ordinary crustal earthquakes, the kind produced along familiar fault systems like California's San Andreas. Continental mantle earthquakes tend to occur in isolation, without the extended aftershock sequences that typically follow a shallow crustal earthquake of comparable size, since the surrounding mantle rock's tendency to flow rather than fracture likely prevents the kind of sustained, cascading stress redistribution that generates a lengthy aftershock sequence in the brittle crust above. They're also, understandably, exceptionally difficult to detect and confirm in the first place. Seismic energy generated at 90 kilometers has to travel through a substantial thickness of rock before ever reaching surface instruments, losing a meaningful portion of its intensity along the way, which is precisely why the original 1979 Randolph earthquake went completely unfelt by residents living directly above it, despite technically registering a genuine magnitude 3.8 rupture. It's worth understanding why this discovery actually matters for the field of seismology, beyond simply resolving one long-doubted, decades-old data point. Earthquake hazard assessment, the entire practice of estimating how likely a damaging earthquake is in a given region, and how strong it might become, has traditionally been built around monitoring and modeling stress accumulation within the crust specifically, the layer where essentially all previously known continental earthquakes were understood to originate, confirming that a genuine separate category of earthquake can occur considerably deeper within the mantle itself, in specific geological settings, like the edge of an ancient Craton root, adds an entirely new dimension to how seismologists need to think about regional hazard, at least in areas positioned near a similar deep geological structure. It also raises a genuinely open question that researchers are actively working through right now, whether continental mantle earthquakes might exist in other cratonic regions around the world that simply haven't been identified yet, precisely because nobody had a clear reason to look for genuine seismic activity at such extreme, previously assumed impossible depths before this specific Utah research effort went looking. It helps to understand cratons themselves a bit more deeply, since they're not a widely familiar geological concept outside of specialized earth science circles, despite underlying huge portions of several continents. Cratons represent the oldest, most stable cores of continental crust, some containing rock confirmed to be well over 2.5 billion years old, roughly half the age of the planet itself. Over geological time, these ancient cores have functioned almost like anchors, remaining largely undeformed while newer crust formed, collided, and rearranged itself around their edges through the ordinary churn of plate tectonics playing out across billions of years. The Wyoming Craton specifically underlies a substantial portion of Wyoming and extends into neighboring states, and geologists have long recognized it as one of several such ancient cores scattered across North America, sitting alongside similarly stable, ancient regions like the Canadian Shield further north. What makes the edges of a Craton geologically interesting, and evidently seismically active in ways nobody previously appreciated, is precisely the boundary zone where that ancient, rigid material meets younger, more mobile, surrounding crust and mantle, a genuine seam in the planet's structure where very different types of rock with very different mechanical properties are forced to interact continuously over enormous spans of time. Cratons exist on essentially every continent, which is exactly why this discovery has generated real interest beyond the specific research team studying northern Utah and southwestern Wyoming. The Canadian Shield, portions of Australia's interior, large sections of Siberia, and significant stretches of Africa and South America all sit atop their own ancient cratonic cores, each with its own distinctive edges where ancient stable rock meets younger surrounding material. If the specific mechanism identified in Utah, concentrated strain generated as mobile mantle material flows against an ancient, deeply rooted craton edge, turns out to be a genuinely general phenomenon, rather than something unique to this one particular geological setting, similar continental mantle earthquakes could plausibly be waiting to be identified along Craton boundaries in any of these other regions as well, simply because nobody had a specific reason to search for genuine seismic activity at such extreme, previously assumed impossible depths until this Utah research effort demonstrated it was worth looking. It's also worth being fair and precise about what this discovery does and doesn't mean for anyone currently living in the region where these earthquakes have occurred. Continental mantle earthquakes documented so far have all registered in the magnitude 3 to 4 range, genuinely minor events by any standard measure of earthquake hazard, and their substantial depth means even a moderate magnitude. 4 event at that distance below the surface arrives at ground level dramatically weakened compared to a shallow crustal earthquake of the same magnitude. Nobody felt the original 1979 event at all, and the 2025 Maser earthquake, despite reaching magnitude 4.1, similarly produced no significant reports of damage. Researchers aren't suggesting this newly confirmed category of earthquake represents some previously hidden, more severe hazard to communities across northern Utah and southwestern Wyoming. What they are saying is that a genuinely new, previously unrecognized physical process is actively generating real seismic activity deep beneath this specific region, a discovery that reshapes scientific understanding of how and where earthquakes can occur, even if it doesn't meaningfully change the practical, everyday earthquake risk picture for people living directly above it. There's a deeply satisfying, very human thread running through this entire story, too, worth sitting with before wrapping up. George Zandt spent decades with a finding from early in his career treated as likely mistaken by much of the broader seismological community, an unresolved, faintly embarrassing data point rather than a genuine scientific breakthrough. He went on to a long, respected career on the geology faculty at the University of Arizona, well beyond that initial disputed 1979 analysis. Nearly 50 years later, he returned to help the next generation of researchers confirm that his original number, one he calculated with far more limited tools and computing power than modern seismologists have access to today, had been correct all along. That's a rare, satisfying arc in scientific research, a finding doubted for the better part of a career, ultimately vindicated not by the original researcher alone, but by an entirely new generation applying better tools to the same fundamental question, with the person who first noticed the anomaly present to see it confirmed. It's worth understanding just how unusual and geologically significant cratons are in the first place, since they're the entire physical setting making these Utah earthquakes possible at all. Most continental crust has been repeatedly reshaped, folded, melted, and reformed over hundreds of millions of years through the ordinary churn of plate tectonics, mountain building, and erosion. Cratons are the rare exception, portions of continental crust so old and so structurally stable that they've essentially avoided that constant reworking, some containing rock dated to well over 2 billion years old, among the oldest solid material found anywhere on the planet's surface. The Wyoming Craton specifically is one of several such ancient cores scattered across North America, remnants of the earliest continental crust that eventually accreted together, piece by piece, to help form the modern continent. Because these structures are so old, so thick, and so mechanically different from the younger, more mobile mantle material surrounding their deep roots, they create exactly the kind of unusual mechanical boundary where researchers now believe continental mantle earthquakes can occur, a genuinely rare set of geological ingredients that likely doesn't exist in most other places around the world. That rarity, though, cuts both ways when it comes to the open question of where else these earthquakes might be happening undetected. Cratons themselves aren't unique to North America. Similar ancient, stable continental cores exist beneath parts of Africa, Australia, Northern Europe, and Asia, several of which sit in regions with considerably less dense seismic monitoring infrastructure than northern Utah and southwestern Wyoming currently benefit from. If continental mantle earthquakes genuinely require this specific combination of an ancient craton root interacting with surrounding mantle flow, there's no clear reason to assume Utah's example is the only place on the planet where the right conditions exist. It may simply be the first place anyone had both a compelling initial anomaly, Zandt's original 1979 puzzle, and the sustained institutional interest required to eventually go back and properly investigate it using modern tools. Other regions with comparable ancient craton structures, but without their own equivalent of a persistent, unresolved 1979 mystery motivating a dedicated research team, may simply be waiting for someone to ask the same kind of question researchers at the University of Utah finally did. So where does this leave our broader understanding of what's actually happening beneath our feet? A minor 1979 Utah earthquake, dismissed for decades as too strange and too deep to be entirely trustworthy, has become the founding case study for an entire newly confirmed category of seismic activity, continental mantle earthquakes occurring along the ancient, deeply rooted edge of iceberg-like cratons, in settings where rock was assumed to flow rather than fracture. 9 confirmed events, spanning nearly half a century, clustered along one specific ancient geological boundary in the American West. Researchers are now actively working to understand exactly how common this phenomenon might be in similar cratonic settings elsewhere around the world. A genuinely open question this discovery has only just begun to answer. We'll continue following this research as scientists work to understand how widespread this newly confirmed category of earthquake might actually be. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.